Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Shandell Hoover, APA Director of Science Special Projects and Implementation. Today's program is part of an APA Science Training Series that is focused on the integration of new tools and techniques to support cutting-edge psychological research. A special thanks to APA Division 5 Quantitative and Qualitative Methods and the Society of Indian Psychologists, SIP, for partnering with us to host this training session. We hope you will visit our Science Training Session webpage to check out the rest of the training sessions in the series. All sessions are being recorded, and everyone who registers will receive a link to the training in about 2 weeks after the live stream. We also invite you to subscribe to Science Spotlight, your source for the most relevant news, information, funding, and opportunities for psychological scientists. Before we get started with today's session, I want to share a few quick announcements. First, thanks to those of you who submitted questions for today's program when you registered. You can also ask a question as a program is taking place in real time. There is a Q&A feature on the dashboard. Please enter your questions there. We'll be monitoring those questions throughout the program. Also, this program is being recorded, so once it ends, everyone who registered will receive an email with a link to the recording, a transcript, and presentation materials about 2 weeks after this live stream. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Joseph Gahn, our panel moderator and organizer today. Dr. Joseph Gahn is an international expert in the psychology and mental health of American Indians and other indigenous peoples. A professor at Harvard University, Dr. Gahn has collaborated with tribal communities for nearly 30 years to critique conventional mental health services and harness traditional culture and spirituality for advancing indigenous well-being. He is the immediate past president of the Society of Indian Psychologists. In 2023, Dr. Gahn received a Gold Medal Award for Impact in Psychology from the American Psychological Foundation. We are so thankful that Dr. Gahn has assembled such an amazing panelist and look forward to this conversation. Thanks so much, Dr. Gahn.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hoover. We so appreciate your support and also the support of Peggy and Allison today to make this all flow so smoothly. Thanks, folks. It's good to see you all in the way that we do in these sorts of webinars. My name, as you heard, is Joseph Gahn. I am a clinical community psychologist and an interdisciplinary social scientist. I teach at Harvard, so I've been a professor here for about 5.5 years now. I'm also the faculty director of the Harvard University Native American program. And I'm an enrolled member or tribal citizen of the Aani-Grovant tribal nation of Montana. We're on the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation in north central Montana, where I hail on my dad's side from the Azure and the Brisboe families, and on my mom's side from the Gahn and the Crazy families. And as you can tell, I carry my mother's surname, and I always say it's a good thing she didn't hyphenate her family names, or I'd be a psychologist named Dr. Gahn Crazy, which may not go over so well. I'm talking today from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and as we often do in Indigenous spaces, I start with an acknowledgement of land and people. Harvard University is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this training, Indigenous Knowledges as Research Methodologies in Psychology, Anti-Colonial Applications of Indigenous Ways of Knowing by Native Psychologists. And I want to give you a very brief origin story. I sat down at the last APA convention in August of 2023 with Dr. Fred Wirtz, who is currently the president of Division 5 of APA, which is Quantitative and Qualitative Methods. And we talked through what it might look like to try put on some kind of seminar, webinar on Indigenous research and methodologies. And we were struggling with how exactly to organize it and who should sponsor it and how we would pay for it. And so I approached my colleagues on the executive committee of the Society of Indian Psychologists, including President B.J. Boyd and President-elect Mark Standing Eagle Bays, to talk through whether SIP might be willing to help sponsor and support. And they were. I'm so grateful for that. And then we enlisted the help of Debbie Bandelos, who's the past president of Division 5, and I think it was Professor Abandalos who approached the APA Science Directorate, and we were able to work then with Shandell Hoover since then to make sure that this was sponsored in the way it is. So thanks very much to all of our co-sponsors and all of the people who helped bring this about. We're really excited to join you today around these topics. You know, as we think about indigenous psychology, it can mean a lot of different things. Part of what indigenous psychology, the term refers to, is, you know, the very diverse psychologies that are enacted and expressed by indigenous peoples. But I think it also entails or implies a consideration of the implications of indigenous ways of knowing for knowledge production within our discipline. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. This is really about research and research methods more so than clinical activity or in that sort of thing. So if you came for clinical activity, that would be a different kind of webinar. I'm not even sure the science directorate would necessarily support that in the same way. And also we're here to talk about Big I indigenous peoples of the USA and Canada, the hundreds of tribal nations and populations who occupy reservations and reserves and exercise sovereignty in the US and Canada that has not been broken since time immemorial. We're not really considering little I indigenous in the sense of local or particular cultural bound kinds of approaches to psychology, but indigenous peoples. And indigenous peoples, of course, share across great diversity the colonial legacy, which is to say that Europeans and Euro-Americans and Euro-Canadians have dispossessed and marginalized and subjugated us throughout history, and in that process have produced harmful knowledge about us, all in the process of kind of exploitative and damaging research in our communities by outsiders. And so an ongoing anti-colonial struggle by indigenous peoples involves or responds to efforts to unseat this kinds of research practices and to provide alternatives to hegemonic methodologies and approaches within all academic disciplines, including psychology. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome 4 indigenous psychologists, all early career psychologists, who will share their experience and expertise concerning the identification and application of indigenous ways of knowing for research in psychology. And so our structure today is pretty straightforward. We'll finish up this intro here, and then we'll hear from each of our 4 indigenous early career psychologists who will present about their research and how they incorporated indigenous research methodologies. And then we'll shift to Q&A. And I have a number, actually over 100 questions that were already pre-submitted by folks who registered for the webinar, but also there'll be opportunity for some live Q&A as well if you prefer to do that. And so, without further ado, let me welcome our first presenter today, Dr. Maria Crouch. Dr. Maria Christina Crouch, Deg Hitan and Coahuiltecan Nations, is a clinical community psychologist and a postdoctoral research fellow at Yale School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry. Her program of research is focused on the interaction of trauma-informed care, evidence-based practices, and practice-based evidence, indigenous approaches, to address alcohol and drug misuse, trauma, and social determinants of health among American Indian and Alaska Native communities from a cultural, strengths-based approach. Please, Dr. Crouch, the floor is yours.
Dogadin, thank you. I appreciate that. Hello, everyone. So I am Maria Crouch. My Degnoc name is Tavo, and I'm originally from Alaska. My family is from the native village of Anvik, Alaska, and I'm presenting today from the traditional lands of the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking peoples in Connecticut. So I'd like to talk to you about Indigenous elder-centered research methodology. But first, I'd like to begin with the consideration of science, or rather, what is science? So the material substance of our universe, matter, atoms, particles, molecules, is everything we can see and feel. And the law of conservation of mass states that nothing is created or destroyed, it changes form rather. So in Alaska Native science, we know this to be true. And this is the basis of reincarnation and the belief that all things, person, animal, plant, is sacred and interconnected. We also know that nothing is discovered or found. Rather, it has been here and perhaps only re-encountered or re-envisioned across time. And spirituality is inseparable from science. And as Dr. Oscar Coagli has said, Yupiaq people view the world as being composed of 5 elements: earth, air, fire, water, and spirit. Aristotle spoke of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. However, spirit has been missing from Western science. The incorporation of spirit in the Upyaq worldview resulted in an awareness of the interdependence of humanity with the environment, a reverence for and a sense of responsibility for protecting the environment. Dr. Coagley also states, when we rely only on Western means of research, we are limiting the possibilities of new insights, and yet this is what our institutions of higher learning are expected to espouse and teach. Most areas of formal social and scientific inquiry teach only one way of trying to learn and understand phenomena in the world around us. In an Alaska Native worldview, cultural and ancestral wisdom are scientific epistemology, ontology, axiology. That is the nature of knowing human beings and values. So please consider that these could be true. Consider that other ways of knowing and viewing the world are equally as valid, that there are multiple realities, if not at least multiple perspectives. And it is with this integrated Native way of knowing that I co-construct, co-conceptualize, and co-conduct my line of research. All right, so in developing an elder-centered research methodology, I'd like to briefly touch on some of the frameworks we utilized. First, evidence-based practice is the Western paradigm's tried and true science, whereas practice-based evidence is an Indigenous model for understanding the scientific practices that have been used for time immemorial among Indigenous communities. So Indigenous research frameworks are a collection of Indigenous theoretical methods, designs, and approaches that guide the research process. The foremost commonalities among Indigenous-led research are to respect Indigenous knowledge and to conduct research relationally, and research for and about Indigenous people must include the cultural context of the people themselves, because the very foundation of our existence is built in relation to each other, the land, and life as we know it. And when we talk about elders, we're talking about people who've been identified by their community as wisdom keepers, knowledge holders, spiritual people who carry our cultures, traditions, and practices. They are like encyclopedias, scientific sources, and libraries. And overall, while people are fallible, right, our elders live lives and give to the community in a way that is an example of living in the good way or the right way. So there were 3 research endeavors beginning in 2010, where we developed and we built upon the support of an elder-centered research methodology and paradigm. So this is predicated on the following overarching research question: what composes a decolonial, Indigenous, elder-centered research methodology that is inclusive, effective, actionable, and recursive and reciprocal? The first collaboration was between Alaska Native elders, researchers, and the Stanford Geriatric Education Center. And what we did there is we developed teaching modules for providers who are caring for Alaska Native elders experiencing dementia. And it was out of this project that the elders themselves told us, talked with us, and guided us towards the following research studies. So study number 1 that you see before you, we wanted to understand pre-colonial and present cultural practices that compose optimal dementia care for Alaska Native people. And we conducted an exploratory grounded theory study. So there were 12 semi-structured interviews with Alaska Native elders that assessed the etiology, course, treatment, caregiving, and then these culturally derived meanings of memory function, loss, decline, and disease. So the 8 culturally grounded themes that you see before you range from traditional knowledge systems and values to connection, communication, and compassion. Overall, we learned that healthcare systems providing services to Alaska Native populations could, not surprisingly, benefit from elder-centered conceptualizations and approaches to caregiving. And in fact, all healthcare systems could benefit from a tailored approach to treatment, as opposed to a one-size-fits-all, which was reported by the participants to feel culturally incongruent, stigmatizing, and then in their own words, inhumane. And then this built on to study 2, where we utilize Kleinsman explanatory model of illness. So this model suggests that care providers ask their clients questions to gain insights into the client's worldview, culture, social context, and spirituality. And exploring what is most important to clients can help build a trusting relationship between the client and the care providers. So there were 32 semi-structured interviews, and observed were 5 themes for caregivers, ranging from what you see before you, growing old, to loss of elders, and then 5 themes for providers, ranging from age-related disease to too difficult to determine. And overall, what was learned is that caregivers and healthcare providers express concern about the lack of understanding, resources, and awareness of dementia among Alaska Native peoples in rural and urban communities. So both caregivers and providers recognize this need to obtain early diagnosis, blend Western and traditional medicines, promote lifestyle and dietary changes, and then foster culturally centered, elder-centric trainings for caregivers. So what did we do? This is the really important question here. We were guided by the elder advisors and the participants, and our research process and conceptualizations of the results were based on established collective Alaska Native values of respect, sharing, knowledge of self and family, acceptance, patience, taking care of others, honoring our elders, prayer, and then this interrelated nature of all life. We started at a place of elder wisdom and knowledge for the development of our research. In fact, it was guided by Alaska Native elders from conceptual discussion through dissemination and beyond. And the elder-centered research methodology is an Indigenous research cycle that is iterative, integrative, and analogous to tribally led, community-driven, and what you know as decolonizing approaches. And as you can see in the slide, it begins across 4 quadrants with respect and partnerships. That leads into careful and patient relationship that is community-led and engaged. In turn, results are an expression of that relationship and reciprocally understood. And what is shared is both Indigenous and at the intersection of co-creation and seeing connections. For us, this looked like relationship with the elders that truly guided the research. So beginning in 2010, and then this continued to this very day across multiple research projects. And the elder engagement and their contributions are active and important. For example, if an elder suggests or requests a change to the study, pause the study, and then we would incorporate that, go through the IRB process, all of that. So they were given, they held as much power, if not more power, than any of the other collaborators throughout, and were given respect and reverence throughout the process. In study 1, conversations with participants often occurred in their homes, and then the researchers always started with a traditional practice, song, drumming, and always a meal to share. Traditional introductions were given, so name, where you're from, what are your family names, and then conversations first began to build relationships prior to the engagement in research activities. And every participant was asked, what else should be asked? And then those questions were both incorporated into subsequent interviews, and prior participants were then contacted about those questions. So to give you an example, one elder in the beginning said, you need to be asking, what is Alaska Native spirituality? So we did that. We asked subsequent participants, we went back and asked participants, and we found that actually framed the study that we did, and it was critically important to understanding what we did. All participants were provided the results in pamphlet form, so with words and images, and then there was a follow-up interview to really talk with them, discuss, get their input and their feedback. So for example, one of the changes that we made, one of the elders said, it's great that you're saying Alaska Native, but I need you to say Indigenous more, because this reflects the fact that across the world, Indigenous people are all related and interconnected. And so we were able to make that change as well. And elder advisors were part of the quality. Oh, sorry, am I over? Are you stopping me? Oh, okay. And then elder advisors were part of the qualitative analyses, and they provided oversight, insight, and approvals on all study materials, results, and dissemination materials. So to give you an example of the data, we had these 2 ideas. One was returning to the second childhood. So this idea that the end stages was actually a spiritual process of a person In the Western sense, it's like brain death and they're becoming childlike. But in the Indigenous sense, it was going through a spiritual process of reliving childhood as one is going back into the universe. And what is principal to an elder-centered methodology is the elders. They are active, embodied, and engaged representatives of the community of research, partnerships, traditional values, and then the ancestral and cultural wisdom of the community. And so who you see here are 3 of the cultural elders and advisors who have been a part of it, and I continue to collaborate with to this day. And the research really grew out of a progression of elder-centric processes that demonstrated the importance of, 1, creating elder advisory councils. This is where they are empowered and they're co-creators of the research. So in Western science, you go first to the seminal articles, right? What then if your science is based on oral traditions that is passed down? Then you go to that source, to the elders, to the wisdom holders. 2, identifying knowledge holders. In community organizing, we often say those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. But if we take this a step further, those closest to the solution also conceptualize the problem and strengths, both the seen and unseen. So not only did we seek elders, but we also work with subject matter experts. For example, the late Kay Branch, who is the director of elder services at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. Elder and ancestral knowledge systems are valid and beneficial and can advance our research paradigms. 4, the reciprocal nature of elder engagement and well-being is integral. It has the power, when done collaboratively and from the heart, as opposed to just from the mind, to be ceremony, to undo past hurts, and can provide healing. So in one example, an elder was going through the data with us and brought up a discussion around a salient memory and began to weep. And then they shared deep insights about the data and how it connected to that memory. Then they thanked us for the opportunity, in their words, to bring up and get out that experience. So the methodology has the potential to impact research for underrepresented groups and to rethink and reshape Western-centric practices. The results and process really lays the foundation for an elder-centered research method that can be adapted and applied to other studies that encourage engagement of those viewed as culture bearers and wisdom holders. And we've often heard this statistic that it takes on average 17 years for research to get into the hands of the knowledge holders. But I challenge you to think about this. What if the knowledge holders had it in their hearts and minds from the beginning, held it throughout, and continued to keep ownership at completion and beyond? What if the knowledge holders were central to their own research? Dogadin, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Crouch, for that amazing presentation. And next, we'll hear from Emma Elliott. Dr. Emma Elliott, Powhatan Tribes, is an assistant professor of learning sciences and human development in the College of Education at the University of Washington, Seattle. She holds both a PhD in educational psychology and a Master of Social Work in Children, Youth, and Families. The interdisciplinary intersections of her research include culture, learning, and human development, land-based and Indigenous methodologies, and trauma, prevention, and recovery among Indigenous children, youth, and families. Please, Dr. Elliott, the floor is yours.
Appreciate the introduction. Thank you so much, Dr. Gon. Siamnat siaya, tlem utsia tala, hait zapka. Good day to each of you. I'm grateful to all of you for joining us today. I'm joining from the ancestral and contemporary territories of the Lushootseed speaking peoples here in Seattle, Washington, including the Duwamish, the Suquamish, the Muckleshoot, the Puyallup, and other Coast Salish nations. I give thanks to the water, the sky, the trees, all for their healing help and for their guidance and their restoration. Today, I'm happy to be sharing with you a talk titled Designing for Ontological Shifts in Community Psychology, Leveraging Indigenous Intellectual Traditions and Practices. By way of introduction, I just want to share with you a few images of some of my loved ones, the social interactions across my lifetime, including my ancestral relations, and the ideas and practices that I take up in my own research and in my own life have been shaped by my own Cowichan community. We have to recognize that in this moment, we have a wonderful opportunity. During chaos, during chaos, imagination can be elicited. And at the moment, we're faced with the global pandemic, systemic racism, widespread white supremacy, a US state-sanctioned and Israeli state-sanctioned war on Palestine and the West Bank. Black and brown people around the world experience this disproportionately, and Indigenous people are particularly impacted in terms of threats to their systems of living, the systems and relationships that are put in place to facilitate our livelihoods. 85% of the world's biodiversity is within Indigenous held territory. That's not a mistake. So today we offer Indigenous methodological traditions and knowledges in order to open up and cultivate different kinds of worlds, different kinds of approaches, and in order to call for an ontological shift in the ways that we approach community psychology. You got to make a change. I'm not going to wrap this for you, but it's time for us as people to start making some changes. Let's change the way we eat. Let's change the way we live, and let's change the way we treat each other. You see, the old way wasn't working, so it's on us to do what we need to do in order to survive. And so there's a lot going on there. We expect our young people to heal within the context of chaos, when in reality, we know that healing, learning, and growing take place within physically safe and psychologically safe relationships. So in order to shape the conversation today, I want to draw on sociocultural theories of learning and healing, both from learning sciences as well as from social work. And I want to couple that with Indigenous intellectual traditions and practices, including Indigenous concepts of relationality, as well as a methodological approach of walking, reading, and storying the land. Next, I want to share with you a land-based ethnography and some reflections that have been shared with me as a way to demonstrate how these design commitments and ontological ways of understanding the world can be enacted in a classroom setting. So in essence, I will share with you how is it that we have gone from these intellectual traditions that have based on my own home community and coupled with the bodies of literature, all the way to what does that mean for everyday social interaction, and how can we transform the ways in which we approach community psychology. So drawing on social cultural theories of learning and development, we know that participation in social and cultural activity is important. We know that as human beings, we don't exist in social isolation. And yet at the same time, we often send our loved ones to treatment or other spaces on their own. And when they come back and they have a difficult time transitioning back into their everyday life, they're sometimes blamed for being the problem, for having a relapse or whatever the situation. And yet at the same time, we recognize that healing, growing, and learning take place within the context of social and cultural practices in families, in communities. And all of these social and cultural interactions iterate upon each other across time and space in ways where our brains, our emotional processes, our spiritual, cultural, and linguistic understandings of the world, and in essence, our entire ontological or understanding of nature of being and the responsibilities that we have as human beings in the world. Learning and healing are social and relational, and they're contingent upon physical and emotional safety. And for far too long, we've been drawing on these narrow ideas and conceptions of our psychological understanding of who we are. In fact, 96% of the citations in the behavioral sciences literature came from only 76% of the world's population. This isn't representative. So what we're offering here is a way to draw on and engage with Indigenous systems of relationality. These are our understandings of who we are as people in the world and how we came to know. All of our understandings about who we are have been developed in deep relationship to the natural world, including our relationships with plants and animals, our ancestors, and all of the natural world elements. The ideas, the processes, including things such as consent or agency or considerations of collective ideas and interrelationships, and the relationality, the reciprocity, and the respect that is imbued within each relationship. That understanding of the world also shapes how we experience the world emotionally and how we act in the world socially. Drawing on Dr. Leanne Samasake Simpson, in one of my favorite quotes, she states, "My ancestors accumulated networks of meaningful, deep, fluid, intimate, collective, and individual relationships of trust. In times of hardship, we did not rely to any degree on accumulated capital or individualism, but on the strength of relationships with others." And when I think about what that means to enact ontologies of relationality in our everyday practice, and to think about what that means in terms of designing for it on purpose, we can engage Indigenous understandings of teaching and learning, and in this case, walking, reading, and storying the land and waters. Walking, reading, and storying the land and waters involves joint activity with other humans or with natural world relatives in ways that emphasize Indigenous understandings of who we are in the world. They reflect different ontological and axiological premises about who our natural world relatives are, and therefore what our responsibilities are as human beings. So really what we're thinking about here are new world-making processes through ontological shifts, and how we can do that in everyday practice, whether it's in education spaces or in healing spaces. Land and other natural world relatives, or more than humans, are semiotic resources for learning and for healing, including material artifacts, ideas, actions, directives, questions, all highlighting features of the land and the ways in which we can learn from and with the land. All of these learning processes that we're talking about today are integral to fostering embodied learning, development, and healing processes. And when we're thinking about our connections to natural world relatives and vast expansion, we're actually all connected, right? We think about the water that we drink is the exact same water that our ancestors have been drinking for thousands and thousands of years. When we think about, the food systems, we're all implicated in participating in food systems that are destructive or violent against Black and brown bodies. So in all kinds of ways, every single one of us have responsibility to participate in what it looks like to transform our ideas and thoughts about nature-culture relations or human relationships and understandings with natural world relatives and nations, such as plants and animals. So to illustrate these design commitments and these design practices as a body of work, they've been developed in collaboration with members of the Cowichan tribes over a series of different projects towards, for example, walking, reading, and storying the land, with the idea that embedded within these stories are the precepts necessary for science, engineering, technology, and so on. And that project, it was an ongoing project that has contributed to the development of some of the ideas that I share in this broad body of work. And I took these learnings from the Cowichan people, as well as from learning sciences and social work theories of learning and healing, and I translated them into a graduate land-based seminar activity that I want to share with you today. With permission of the students in the class and anonymized, I'm going to share with you a graduate seminar that we just wrapped up, and how we can take up these Indigenous and land-based practices on a broader scale and with a heterogeneous population. So what does it look like to take these Indigenous theoretical traditions from theory to praxis in a classroom setting or even in a mental health setting? The graduate seminar was titled Land-Based and Indigenous Approaches to Learning and Healing. Here we implemented the theoretical traditions and design elements that I've shared with you today. In particular, we explored through ethnography the roles of land, water, sky, and place in shaping various dimensions of health and well-being for Brown and Black people in both North America and a little bit in South America. The three main assignments for this class included a land ethnography, where students were tasked with social interaction with the land and the reflection and identification of patterns and processes that they had while they were interacting and visiting with a particular place. And we also included in the class work an epistemic journey writing reflection, so they can think about their own learning and healing processes in relationship to the course readings, as well as the ethnography. And finally, they were asked to develop a concept map so that they can highlight their own understandings and their own land theory in relationship to their learnings across the year, or across the quarter. And today I want to share with you, just drawing on the land ethnography reflections, some of the things that the students shared in terms of their learnings and their healing processes associated with visiting the land. Student A, with their permission and anonymized, shared with us, on the first day of class, Emma asked us, "How did you get here?" I drew and contemplated who my community is and what land means to me. I thought mainly about my eldest brother, who was killed in an avalanche when he was 17. It was the winter of my freshman year in high school. I continue to feel most connected to him when I'm in the snow, especially with siblings and friends who knew him. I situate myself near mountains because when I feel what I can only describe as spiritually grounded and healthy in the presence of snowy high ground. So when I look at this, I can see the rich nuance related to belongingness, identity, and especially connection with her brother who's no longer living. She was processing what his traumatic death in her life meant for him, and in the same way, identifying avenues of healing and support. And in response to the question about how did you get here, this is a backwards looking and future oriented kind of question that asks them to think about the kinds of situations, people, relationships, and social interactions. In essence, their first thoughts on their ontological perspective about how they got here. And so in a follow-up quotation with the same student, they share, "Learning about an avalanche's responsibilities shifted the way I understand my brother's death on an ontological dimension. His own life was a part of an important exchange within a system of relationships. I learned that nurse logs and decomposers play an essential role in nurturing a forest. And I remember that human death is not apart from magnificent ecological changes that scale time and space. Avalanches, like death, play a role in life." And so when I look at this, the student is identifying their learning processes, and you can imagine, because of the metaphor with Indigenous, like the use of metaphor in comparing and understanding something as existential as life and death through the natural world, and the understanding that brought to the student was paramount. So when I think about these kinds of activities, and these were 4 different ethnographies across the course of the quarter, when I think about these kinds of different activities, we can see that throughout, the student is reflecting on the importance of her community and land, and she's especially highlighting the strong ancestral connection that she has to her loved one. She highlights the fact that the healing process is linked to our emotional connection and to the therapeutic presence for her in terms of snow. She highlights her learning process that she learns from the natural world relative to the water, in this case, snow and avalanche, and how that serves as a metaphor for understanding life and death. And these are Indigenous teaching and learning processes, use of metaphor and use of story, oral storytelling, and these kinds of things. And finally, the students' insights bring significant insights into relationships, support systems, belongingness, purpose, life and death, and ethical relationships that have shaped their perspectives and knowledge across time, and how those perspectives and knowledge across time have been shaped and informed by iterative instances of everyday social and cultural interaction. So when I think about this, the big project of addressing wide-scale and global crises, that feels really, really overwhelming. But the smaller project of understanding how ontological shifts and axiological shifts through everyday social interaction feels a little bit more manageable.
Dr. Elliott? Yeah, oh yeah, very good. Thank you. We're at time, so please.
Yeah, thank you. So just end briefly in conclusion, we need to think about and center on in our research and in our relationships, first and foremost, the social and political consequences of our work. We can't just do business as usual. This looks like things like localizing Indigenous knowledge and practice in the ways that we've described so far today. It includes heterogeneity as fundamental to healing and learning. It includes collaborative and co-developed approaches that are locally situated, and therefore, because of the local situation, all of these approaches are also sustainable, ethical, and hopefully consequential. We close by offering and suggesting that Indigenous leadership, decision-making, land stewardship, and self-determination need to be centered every single step of the way. And I give thanks to the following people for their support, and to all of you, to each and every one of you for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Elliott. Fantastic. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Jill Fish. Dr. Jill Fish is an assistant professor of psychology at Macalester College and a licensed psychologist. Jill earned her PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Minnesota in 2020. Her interdisciplinary research focuses on promoting Native American and Indigenous peoples' well-being across the lifespan. She's broadly interested in how Native peoples use their histories and cultures to overcome oppression and to support their healthy functioning. Jill is from the Tuscarora Nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of Western New York. She's a lineal descendant, born and raised in Tuscarora until she moved to St. Paul, Minnesota in 2014, where she currently lives with her husband and son. Dr. Fish, take it away.
Thank you, Joe, for the introduction. All right, Chwant Eskenahe, Gyatha, Jill Fish. I hope all your spirits are doing well today. My name is Jill Fish. As Joe mentioned, I'm from the Tuscarora Nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Today I'm coming to you from St. Paul, Minnesota, which is the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. There are thousands of Dakota and Ojibwe people that live here to this day, along with thousands of other Indigenous peoples in the urban area of St. Paul and Minneapolis. I am trying to use my quiet voice today because my son is sleeping in the next room. If you all know me and have seen me present before, I don't necessarily have a quiet voice, so trying to do this as best as I can. Today I'm talking to you about story-based methodologies of relational, reciprocal, and responsible ethos. So I just want to start by talking about what exactly it is when I refer to an ethos. Ethos is a Greek word, and it broadly refers to a disposition, morals, and character. So my research starts with my ethos, and my ethos is rooted in relationality, reciprocity, and responsibility. To me, this is what I must absolutely ground my research in to do research well for and with Indigenous peoples. So a lot of us have talked about these concepts today, so I am going to go over these quickly so I can get into my methodology more. But relationality, this generally refers to the idea that we are all connected, past, present, and future, to other human beings, but also to our non-human beings, animals, plants, water, and all spiritual beings in this universe. My research ethos is also grounded in reciprocity, which refers to the mutual and consensual give and take of a relationship. It also acknowledges that sometimes we are giving with no expectation that there is something coming in return, but we are in consensual relation with one another, and people are doing things that they want to do, that they want to share. They are sharing things that they want to share, and engaging in behaviors that are consistent with them and in that relationship. And then finally, the last part of my ethos is responsibility. So respecting others, but also doing things that actively engage in ending harm. This is really important to me and the research that I do, that not only am I maintaining and creating good relationships with people, that people want to be in these relationships with me, and that I am giving to them hopefully as much as they are giving to me, but that I am doing something in relationship with individuals that can actively engage in ending harm, which, as Dr. Elliott Groves mentioned, is so important right now in the global context that we're all living in. So something else that is an important part of my ethos that I wanted to share is this quote that I actually recently stumbled upon by Dr. Stephen Salaita, who is a scholar of Indigenous studies and settler colonial studies. And he says, "In situations of disparate power, formal knowledge belongs to the oppressor, with its highbrow bureaucrats and bourgeois institutions, but the oppressed possess something much more powerful and intuitive, a profound need to free themselves of injustice and subjugation." So to me, when I conduct my research with Indigenous peoples and I'm partnering with people, I want to do things that are pushing back against traditional structures of knowledge, especially in psychology, but also elsewhere. To me, it's my job to unsettle psychology and to make it experience some discomfort by using these methodologies that are more consonant with Indigenous ways of being and knowing in the world. So I'm going to talk to you ambitiously about two projects. One is a project that I worked on previously, and one is one that I'm working on now. The first one is Originatives. So Originatives is a research project that I started in 2018, and it ran through 2019, but it's a digital storytelling project broadly about the role that culture and history play in Native people's lives. I included the website here so you can actually view the digital storytelling project, which is very much a scholarly project, but also a public-facing project. I originally adapted it from the Immigrant Stories Project at the University of Minnesota. And essentially, it's a one-day digital storytelling workshop for community members to create a digital story about their life, their culture, and their history. So oftentimes when I first start talking to people about Originatives, and I start talking about how this is an Indigenous methodology, and I talk about digital storytelling, it might give some people some pause when I talk about this digital aspect of storytelling. And I hope it does, but what I want to highlight is that Indigenous peoples are modern people. We are modern people. We have traditional and modern cultural practices, and digital storytelling is one that brings those two together, that empowers people to create a story about their lives and use their voice and their images and pictures to represent themselves the way that they want to. I think this is really important in psychology because historically, psychology has not represented Native and Indigenous peoples very well. It's taken a deficit perspective to a deficit lens and an exploitive and extractive lens to understanding our communities, interpreting results through ways that are harmful to us, our self-determination and our sovereignty. So what I like to do with digital storytelling is use it as a literal space and place for people to come together, to meet one another, to nurture their relationships, and to talk about themselves and their lives and their cultures in words, in their own words and from their own perspectives, and to bring that into psychology to show exactly how we want to be represented, how Indigenous peoples want to represent ourselves. So some people might not be familiar with digital storytelling. This is a process that's a research method that's largely used in the humanities. It's a participatory approach. So the researcher, which would be me in this instance, is largely a participant in this process as well. And then the participants are also researchers. They're telling me what they think should be in the research. And I'm constantly pivoting and adapting to make the process fit with what they want it to be. But before Originatives and beyond Originatives, digital storytelling does have a general structure to follow. So digital storytelling mostly involves a participant writing a story. This can be as long as someone wants it to be, but generally it's between 300 and 500 words. Then the person is using that story as their script, and they're recording an audio voiceover of themselves. So they're actually saying their story out loud. After they're done with that, people gather images, videos, and music that they want to use and share and compile to create a story about their life. And then they're putting this all together in video editing software and creating a short digital story, which is ultimately a video. And then optional, people can share their story if they would like to, but do not always have to. So what did this look like when I took this research method and used it with Indigenous peoples? What I did was I took this digital storytelling workshop and I turned it into this one-day event. And I did 22 workshops through partnerships with 11 Native serving organizations in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Duluth. In these workshops, participants came having written a draft of their story, and they would come together at this Native organization and finish writing their story, and then they would work with myself and research assistants, one of which is in attendance to this talk today. So hi, Peyton, thank you for coming. Who would come and work with our research assistants in recording their story and then putting it into the video editing software, and we would scan their images in. It was really amazing. People would come into workshops and they would bring their photo albums with them. So we could actually look through pictures with them. And this was an all-day process. This is like an 8 to 8.5 hour long day where myself and my research assistants and the participants are just working together on creating these digital stories and helping people find the words to tell the story that they want to tell. And if people already have the words to tell that story, then just giving them the space and the tools to do that, to create this little memento, this little gift of a story that they can take with them to show what they were like at this one place in time. So in Originatives, we came together in the morning at a Native org. Participants came, we opened with smudging and a talking circle to introduce ourselves, to start building these relationships, to be connected with each other in a meaningful way, which is really different than sending out a Qualtrics survey to each other, to your participants, where I would never meet or engage with a participant in a very meaningful way, other than collecting their data. For me in Originatives, this was an opportunity to meet people and to grow our relationships and make meaningful connections, and have a chance to let someone tell a story about their life in real time and experience change just in lieu of being able to share something that they don't get an opportunity to often share in other aspects of their lives. So we opened with a talking circle. Participants immediately started working on their digital stories, collecting images, finishing their stories, recording their voiceovers, and then we always shared food throughout the day. We always had lunch with participants and community members. We didn't work on our stories during that time. That was a time for us to connect even more and talk. And then in the afternoon, community members finished their digital stories and then had the option of sharing them if they wanted to. They could share them with the other people in the workshop, but they could also have the option of giving me consent to share their story. So eventually 75 community members create a digital story and 68 are hosted on Originatives' website. So why digital storytelling? It gives people the opportunity to author your own narrative, to create community and peer connections. It allows for the transmission of knowledge orally, but also when people share that story with other people. It promotes self-understanding and healing, and it allows people to engage in storytelling practices in a place where they might not be able to otherwise. So digital storytelling to me is always in a relational, reciprocal, and responsible ethos. It's intentionally relational and in community settings. It builds on Indigenous traditions of storytelling and orality. It's active and empowering research method, and it's also generative and paradigm shifting. Generative for the people involved, but also generative for the public who gets to hear and listen to these stories and shift and change and respond to it. In response to it. So this is Originatives. People will often ask, like, you did 22 workshops, they were 8.5 hours a piece, you traveled for these, like, was it worth it? And I say, yes, absolutely. Like, you get to see Native people and Indigenous peoples represented through their voices, their pictures, their images, all in this gallery, which is very much living and breathing and evolving and changing as people continue to watch and grow and learn from these stories. So I did plan on talking about Indigenous joy, but I see Joe in my corner, and I really was really ambitious here. If you want to talk to me about Indigenous joy, please email me and read these slides. I would love to talk to you about the conversational method and approach that I used with my wonderful colleagues and collaborators on this project. But again, time is of the essence. So I will wrap up here. And I will skip that. But again, please contact me if you want to talk to about it. But I just think for me, an Indigenous methodology, I'm rereading Linda Two-Way-Smith's Decolonizing Methodologies right now. And she just talks a lot about the importance of stories and telling, trying to get the story right and tell the story well. And I think in my research, using storytelling in this way, I'm not doing narrative psychology. I'm not collecting open-ended responses from people. I'm actually sitting with people, sometimes on their couches, helping them create and tell a story about a moment in their life. It's a way for me to engage in ethical research. It foregrounds Indigenous cultural practices. It strengthens our relations and communities, and it's always an intentional choice. So for everyone here today, my takeaway is just engaging in Indigenous and decolonizing and these methodologies that we're all talking about here. You can always do something different. This is an intentional choice and way of being and relating in the world that I choose to do. So thank you, Nyawa, for giving me the opportunity to be here today. And thanks, everyone. I'll turn it back over to Joe.
Thank you, Dr. Fish. We really appreciate it. Next, I'm going to introduce Haley Shea. Dr. Haley Shea is a licensed psychologist with a private practice in Cincinnati, Ohio, and serves as director of the Office of Assessment and Evaluation at the Miami Center at Miami University. Her research team focuses on understanding the impacts that language and cultural revitalization has had on citizens of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma, and she's a member of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. She has most recently focused on developing a conceptual model and measurement tool for understanding living well from a Miami-specific perspective. Dr. Shea, the floor is yours.
Missionaire, thank you. So Aya Cheki, Kisha Koch Gwains were on in Hinila Miamisquia. To pay with Neolaka Koke Cheki Wahane Hipe Kaka Ishasenge. We pitch a Kionge ne Cincinnati, Ohio, in Minuta Ane, Michikanakwa ne Hipinjiwa Ilapikase Ane. Hello, everyone. My name is Haley, and I am a citizen of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. I said it's great to see you all here, and I hope we can continue these conversations. I am originally from what we today call Huntington, Indiana, and I currently live in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is the traditional homelands of the Miami people, as well as the Shawnee. And I'm a descendant of Chiefs LaFontaine and Richardville. And I feel honored just to even be here to participate in this panel, and am humbled even virtually sitting next to such incredible scholars. To me, this conversation about Indigenous research methodology is all about what and who is being centered in the work. Whose agenda, whose voice, whose knowledge, whose methods, who do the results serve? And so I plan to share with you all a few concrete examples of how my research team has engaged in this. And while there are specific methodologies that are unique to Indigenous research methods, in my opinion, it is more about epistemological shifts and raising up Indigenous knowledge system that matters most. Without that, the specific methods aren't as important. And so the ideals of Indigenous research methodology find their way into even just the formation and foundation of a research team. In order to truly carry out Indigenous research, the foundation and center of the work, as I think every single other person on this panel has said, is reciprocity, relationship, and shared trust. Right? My team began in 2012 when I was actually still an undergraduate student myself at Miami University. Daryl Baldwin, the executive director at the Miami Center, tasked a group of researchers who had been embedded in the community in various ways for over 15 years at that point, to try to understand the impact that language and cultural revitalization has on our community. And over time, we've developed a highly interdisciplinary team that includes both tribal and non-tribal members with backgrounds in psychology, public health, medicine, education, and second language acquisition. And so to me, this is how Indigenous research works. We work with interconnected ways of understanding the world and united on our shared understanding of a specific culture. And so my team pulls primarily from a community-based participatory research model. right? This is, what a lot of people would label as like a Western research model, but to me, it holds up the values of Indigenous research in that it equitably involves community members, researchers, and stakeholders as all equal contributors to the process. It recognizes and values the knowledge possessed by each. We're most often using a mixed methods approach primarily because the existing models and theories don't always work for our community, and so we have to build those for ourselves in a lot of ways. A really critical part for both for us, but anyone wanting to engage with Indigenous research is getting approval from tribal IRBs alongside other institutional IRBs. For our community that sits within the Miyamia Center serves as our IRB. However, other tribes have formal IRBs, and if not, engaging with key leaders in the tribe to get approval for the project is critical, right? That step has been missed in the past and is part of a contributing factor as to why so much exploitation has existed in Indigenous research in the past. CBPR is a very flexible and iterative process, requiring us to make accommodations along the way as things change. Communities are not static. We are changing all the time. And as that change happens, so does our research. Our research also has to change. Every single step of the process should be taken with community input. Rather than assuming a community doesn't understand something like the analysis of quantitative data, for example, explaining it and allowing them to help make decisions along the way. We also design most of our research projects from a longitudinal perspective and always with sustainability in mind, which inherently means that our work is kind of slow going. So I also want to emphasize that our work specifically is directed by the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma leadership and the Miami Tribe is also the direct beneficiary of our work. So to illustrate this a little bit, in 2012, when the KNOT team, my research team, was being formed, tribal leadership got together with our team to identify the outcomes we are interested in. So our tribal leadership were the ones to say, here is what is important from a research perspective. And ultimately, it was decided that we wanted to understand how language and cultural revitalization, and therefore the education resulting from that, impact academic attainment, well-being, community connectedness and engagement, and national tribal growth and continuance. And so I want to share more about our process of developing these research questions. And we did this translational process for each and every one of these questions, but I'm going to use just one, the method that I'm going to explain further later, to illustrate. And that's the second one about well-being. So we first identified a research question that stems from what you would call like a Western or scientific way of thinking. And that read, does language and cultural education impact well-being, right? That's the broad umbrella question. And then we got together with language and cultural experts within the tribe to identify how do Miyamia people themselves understand this question? How would we ask this question? And that came out to Tanije nehe mito sinuiangwe, wejilandiangwe, nehe tehendiangwe, melona teheyangwile, kenepuayo nemenane. And then we translate that back to English and it reads, how does reflecting on our ways of knowing cause us to live properly and to be at peace with each other? Right? And so I pause because that's a very different way of thinking about the world. Right? So, the language and cultural education is important, but more important is the reflection on our own ways of knowing. Second, living properly, our word for that, nahimeto sinuwingi, literally translates to live a proper human life, right? And then lastly, this concept of to be at peace with one another. I'll talk about this in a moment, but it's based in the notion that health and peace are intricately connected and cannot be separated. And so because this research question had not been fully developed, our team set out to understand it a bit better. During the lockdown portion of COVID, when we had a lot of time on our hands, Daryl Baldwin, the executive director, and I met weekly on Zoom for a couple of years, actually, to discuss what does health, wellness, living properly mean from a Miyamia perspective, right? And the research methods we took at that time were we consulted documentary records from Jesuit missionaries and other anthropologists who have studied our people. We looked at written works on the community, both from within and outside of the community. We looked at interviews and conducted interviews with tribal elders and knowledge holders. We consulted the linguistic sources that, basically break down our language and what our language has to say about this. We shared personal experiences. We visited our community's stories, our historical narratives, as well as our winter stories. And we shared narratives that had been shared with us by other people, other community members, as well as people from other tribes who had a lot to share. Had we taken a traditional academic approach to research, most of these sources would not be considered credible or valuable, but within the Indigenous research space, they most certainly are. And we wanted to make sure at this time that it didn't become the Daryl and Haley model of Nahimeto Sinawingi, so we also brought the community in. We conducted focus group interviews with community members at key tribal events to try to understand their perspective on this topic of Nahimeto Sinawingi. Within that, we used semi-structured interview questions as well as a card sorting activity so that people could share and come to a consensus on what living well meant to them. And that helped us to take a few concepts that Daryl and I had originally not considered and implement them into our conceptual model. And, similar to how other people have been talking about the process, we danced with them, we ate meals with them, we offered compensation for the expenses it took for them to get there. And then we took that and implemented it in the model. And I make this sound and look linear, but it is this reciprocal and cyclical process where we involve knowledge holders, researchers, and even participants themselves in every step of the iterative process. And at this point, we also brought in external consultants to provide feedback on this project as well, including Dr. Gon, as well as public health faculty, Ryan Rhodes and Roy Oman. And this process resulted in a Miamia construct of wellness. In our language is referred to as Nahimeto Sinawingi, as I mentioned, literally means to live a proper human life. And we begin with these hands as a representation that our system comes about through our human experience and that our Indigenous knowledge system was handed to us by previous generations in order for us to thrive as a tribal nation. And I begin with the introduction of Pilake'one. This term contains the stem Pilake that is used in terms such as Anje Pilake, which is she or he reforms his or her life for the better. It's also found in terms like Pilaki Hake, I heal him, and in certain contexts can mean I grant him or her freedom. And as a simple noun, Pilake'one is translated as health, but the core meaning of the stem is to improve one's condition. The second term is Awende'one. This term contains the stem awem, which is used in terms such as ewemake, I'm related to him or her, or ewengiche, she or he is grateful or thankful. And as a simple noun, it's translated to peace. Now we have established a baseline for these two terms, I want to turn to the expressive and intellectual features of Nahimeto Sinawingi that have emerged. So the next layer includes 5 Nipwayone or knowledge domains, 8 Michele'one or community values, and 5 Miami Wingi intentional interactions. And this layer of our model came from those years of work that Daryl and I engaged in those focus groups. And the final layer of our plan, implementation and evaluation process, we embed this model within our educational curriculum and our teacher training, which then gets passed on to our tribe's cultural resource office for implementation within the community in various types of programming. And then my team steps in to do assessment of those programs, which then that assessment informs the model itself. And it becomes this cyclical process every single year where our model informs what we're doing, which informs our assessment, which reinforms the model, right? It's this cyclical process. And so we are actually currently, we just pulled the data. We stopped data collection on the measurement tool that I mentioned that, Dr. Gon mentioned at the beginning. So I don't have data to share yet, but hopefully in the future, I can share that with you all. Mishinewe, big thanks.
Well, fabulous. Thanks so much. And I'm really grateful to each of you for taking the time to so thoughtfully and carefully prepare some remarks for what is likely a quite a broad crowd of attendees with bringing all kinds of different interests and so on. So now we want to move, we have perhaps 15 minutes or so for Q&A. And so let's get to some questions if we can. Let me start by just saying a few themes that stood out to me, and others who are engaged might in the Q&A enter or nominate additional themes if you like. But a key thing here has to do with relationality. I saw that come up quite a lot. and relationships, between people, of course, but between people and land. And, there's different ways to expand even how we think about who we're in relation and what we're in relationship with. I heard the word respect quite a lot, and the need, especially for respecting elders and for consulting elders and for adhering to people who hold specialized cultural knowledge or language, and drawing upon that in really important ways. I heard about the importance of reciprocity, I'll say, which has to do with not only receiving, but giving back and making sure that the people who are sharing their knowledge, their expertise, their understandings with you are also getting something out of it, and that the community is benefiting in some important way. And so those are just a few of the themes that, stand out across the different presentations that you've offered. I think one thing, and I'll ask this of all of you, so we'll go sequentially in order with the order of presentation, maybe just to hear your response to this. I think people who come to psychology and engage in especially more community applied work and research are aware of participatory research, the desire and interest and commitment to really interacting with people in communities, to include them in designing questions and figuring out what research to undertake, and even interpreting findings and all of that. And that such research needs to be accountable to those people at some level, that there needs to be sharing of research findings and maybe advocacy on behalf of community interests associated with the research. So a kind of participatory approach. And also, I think often in that endeavor, people take on various kinds of qualitative methods, as we call them in psychology, different kinds of approaches to knowledge making that are not really necessarily variable, analytic, or statistical. And so let's just try to be clear if we can. I'd love to hear from each of you, at least briefly, on how is it that Indigenous research methodologies differ from what is already familiar to many psychologists than community engagement, participatory approaches, and qualitative inquiry. Those things are often familiar to people. What we're up to is tailored or configured or harnessed in some way that we label Indigenous. So what is the difference that you see? We'll start with Dr. Crouch.
Thank you. So I think that something key about an Indigenous approach is that it includes all of those, right, in part. But the question being, what is different about an Indigenous approach? One of the things I would add is that it's Indigenous led and conceptualized. And I think in the quotes I provided is that nothing is new, nothing is found. And we understand this in Indigenous culture, that our ways of knowing and being evolve, but have been part of this world as we know it in this universe for time immemorial. And so we pull from knowledge that isn't necessarily a part of the broader Western paradigm or approaches, that being spiritual, that being the land, that being embodied knowledges that are often not to the same degree respected in the same way. And so, like in the research I was talking about, right? Oftentimes, well, not oftentimes. So in Western scientific research, you need something in writing, and it needs to be replicable, and it needs to be objective. And I think we understand, and some researchers understand, that there's not a lot of objectivity, if you will. It's subjectivity. We live in a subjective world, and we know that goes back to our theories of living on the drum. We're all or a wheel or a hoop, we're all at different points holding a different portion of the truth. And we need all of those to come together to really have the full picture. So I think it's a view that's embodied, that's land-based, that's earth-based. And so I guess to give an example of that is this idea that we are inseparable from land, plant, or animal, that we're equally as valuable. It's not this idea that we are somehow this more important, higher order being, rather that literally this idea that we're interconnected and equally as valuable is all part of our scientific research and understanding of the world. And so that's coming at it from a very different perspective and a different way of knowing.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Crouch. I wonder, Dr. Elliott, if you have anything to add in addition to that really rich articulation.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Crouch. As you were talking, I was thinking of what do I think of the differences, and at its core, for me, it's about decolonization, anti-colonial practices, and anti-Black racism. And when we think about what's undergirding those kinds of things, at its core, it's about land and Indigenous land theft and different worldviews. And so therefore, I think that there's importance from an Indigenous methodological perspective to take up that heterogeneity of learning and growing from perspectives that haven't centered colonization as their main frame. And when we ground our understandings of the world and our ways of being in the land, they're based upon consensual, agentic, and respectful and responsible approaches that have something to say about sustainability and consequence, and how we can move forward and imagine a pluriverse or localization of knowledge systems where we can all exist and coexist in respectful relations on Indigenous territory. And what does that evolution look like, and how can we all participate in the necessary evolution and revolution of the ontological ways that we've been approaching both education and mental health?
Wow, thank you so much. Now, this is getting harder the further we go, right? Because you're all covering such great things. But Dr. Fish, I wonder if you have something, some thoughts to add.
Yes, I feel like the pressure is on, but one thing I do want to add is I do feel like that there was a time where Indigenous scholars felt like they have to package their work as qualitative research or participatory action research for it to be valid and legitimate. And I think we are in a time now where we no longer have to do that, where we can claim or reclaim Indigenous knowledges as our own and as a legitimate way of interacting and being in the world, and as a legitimate way that many of our relatives interact and be in the and exist in the world. So I will say too, in rereading decolonizing methodologies now, something that is just consistently talked about by Smith is this idea of spirituality, that is something that is always missing in Western scientific research, that in our research, we're tending to our spirits, to community members' spirits, and something I just wonder is just like in qualitative and participatory action research, did you pray with the community members and the relatives who came in to do research with you? Because I didn't get to talk about Indigenous joy, but we started with prayer. We exchanged tobacco, we gifted tobacco, and we spoke in conversation and relationship with each other, and we recorded that conversation. And at the end of the day, we can say like we're generating knowledge with each other, because that's an Indigenous way of relating and connecting, is telling stories with the goal of helping others and creating an Indigenous future that we want to live in through these stories. So that is what I'll add. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. And Dr. Shea, please.
Yes, so I also feel that same pressure.
Mhm.
But I think, something that's already been alluded to by each of you, but I'll highlight, is the transcendence across time, right? Which falls within the spirituality realm, falls within it falls within a lot of these things that we're talking about. But, our oral traditions is one thing that connects us to our ancestors, right? We're telling the same stories in similar and different ways as our ancestors, and the themes have come down throughout time. There's a thread that connects us to our ancestors and similarly connects us to our future. And that's what's happening in our research as well, right? Is that what we're doing is connecting us both to our ancestors and to future generations. And I don't think that's prevalent in, what we would call like Western research.
Yeah, fantastic. Wow, very illuminating. Thanks, folks. We have time probably to go through one more round on a question. So let me put two questions together. This is from Fred Wirtz, who, as I mentioned earlier, talked about this originally. And so I'm so glad that you asked this question, Fred. I believe one of the greatest benefits of respecting and integrating Indigenous ways of knowing in our psychology is the long overdue integration of science and spirituality. So touching on this theme of spirituality, do you see APA and contemporary psychology as being receptive and welcoming of this kind of advance? And related to that, there's a number of questions from people about, maybe they aren't in departments and training and learning methods with faculty who are quite so open-minded as maybe we were fortunate to find. And so how do you navigate, skepticism or even dismissal or denigration of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous research methodologies in those kinds of departments? So how receptive is psychology to spirituality, and how to navigate when there's skepticism? And we'll just go backwards this time. So please, Dr. Shea.
Different kind of pressure. I think this completely depends on the space and spaces in which you find yourself, because I put myself intentionally in spaces where I do have support. And so I have found that a lot, that there are corners, there are pockets of the field that are very open to this. However, I interestingly have had a kind of a different experience where people hear about spirituality and aspects of spirituality, and they kind of hold it up in this like mystical, like, "Ooh, I'm so amazed by this" kind of a way, as opposed to a dismissal. But it is in itself kind of a dismissal. It's recognizing it as something that's like untouchable, as something that's not real, if you will. And so it is somewhat of a dismissal, but it's not an outright like that's not valid type of a message. And typically the way that I handle that personally, first of all, if it's somebody that's important to me, I will share and open up about my own life and how that has impacted me specifically, and then broaden that out to my whole community. And if it's not somebody that's important to me, I basically ignore it.
Interesting and important strategies, I'm thinking. Please, Dr. Fish, your thoughts.
I think psychology is open to spirituality. I think this science session is also a strong demonstration of showing that APA is ready and willing perhaps to engage in this sort of knowledge, and elevating it and sharing it with other people. So I feel encouraged by that. And simultaneously, there's a lot of work to do, multiple truths. I think, Joe, we're on a paper right now that is coming out sometime soon that talks about a lot of these different changes. And there's not enough time to go into depth here, but I feel like when it comes to you as an individual who is operating in a graduate program or a school or department, I hope people are more open than they may seem. And I can only say that based on my personal experience of, I attended the University of Minnesota, which is very proudly known for Dust Bowl empiricism. And when I first started, that was kind of the kind of researcher I was too. I was really focused on quantitative research. And I changed over time, like just by figuring out the kind of researcher I want to become. But the people who were in contact with me changed over time, just in lieu of being in contact with me too, and became more open to different ways of knowing in the world. And of course, like this just all takes time, more time than we all have, maybe more time than we're willing to give to people. So something I just think of is, protecting your spirit from people who might not be as open and as willing, and maybe finding community with people who are more open. But I think there is room and there is space, especially in our community of Native and Indigenous psychologists. I have really found a home in finding people who think like me, and who want to do the same kind of work that I do. And all of you are here. So thank you, Joe.
Terrific. Dr. Elliott.
Yeah, thank you for the question. How receptive have things been, etc. I think what I find is that people want to participate and they want to do it in a good way. They're often stymied about how to move forward in ways that don't reinscribe processes such as Indigenous erasure or settler colonial violence. And that's really uncomfortable because of the nature of how all of this works in terms of structuring society, in that we all participate. So, if we're all participating in Indigenous erasure and violence against Black and brown bodies, that doesn't feel super good. And we need to think about how is it that we can reconcile that history in good ways, and how can we move into the discomfort, because those discomforts are largely related to epistemic collisions about how we see the world and how we move about in the world. And again, at its core, it's about land and that ontological understanding of land that is at the root of every single war so far. And when I think about directions forward and what to say to folks who might not be on board, for example, I have yet to find any other intellectual tradition around the world and throughout history that I believe can save human existence on Earth in the way that Indigenous intellectual traditions around the world can. I say this because of the sustainability, the ethics, the local, the axiological commitments, and so on. And we also noticed during the global shutdown that all around the world, the Mother Earth was responding. The whales were returning to the Puget Sound. The smog was lifting above the large cities, and we were sharing all of these noticings. The truth of the matter is, Mother Earth has billions and billions of years, but we don't. If we don't get our act together, human existence on Earth will cease. And I think that that's a pretty important project. So to me, it just needs to be done. And we need to do it. Those folks who can imagine something otherwise, imagine a different world, the visionaries of each of our communities, those are the ones who have to stand up and participate with the community members who are actually doing the heavy lift. And if we don't do that, I think we're just going to continue spiraling. Every single one of us have felt the impact of the last 5 or so years, and it's the culmination of all of these global crises that we're experiencing.
Thank you. Wow. Okay, Dr. Crouch, we got about 1 minute.
All right. Thank you. Really wonderful things you each have said, and I appreciate the questions. So the question of, is spirituality welcomed? Yes, in the sense of, I think the dominant Western-centric Christianity has always been welcomed. Has Indigenous spirituality always been welcomed? No. Is it currently? Not necessarily. Does that matter to me? Not so much. In community organizing, we say power isn't given, it's taken. So I feel that in like what we're doing now, in the ways of sharing this knowledge and the research we're doing of the audience, of the non-native, the allies and the native people, this is how we take back that power. I'm reminded of the quote by Audre Lorde, you can't use paraphrasing, you can't use the master's tools in order to dismantle the master's house. Well, we need Indigenous tools, right, in order to do this. That's the talk about decolonizing and indigenizing. And so how do we do that? What do we do? Well, first and foremost, to the Indigenous people, the very act of you being in places and spaces where you were never meant to be is indigenizing. And that is enough, right? And then all of these other things we add to it and we create power and momentum. I think that we can create our space. And this is an example, right, of creating that space and gaining this momentum and power in these places, in spaces of what we can do. We need allies. And we need folks to care about these things, but also to expand the ways that you're thinking. And, the colonizers first colonized themselves. And there's this, Haley, Dr. Shea, you talked about how people are very attracted to Native spirituality. I think it's because they've colonized themselves and they see, oh, here is a culture that knows who they are, and this is attracted to me. They come to it and then they colonize, because the colonized mind begins to colonize. So the decolonization first happens in the mind and the heart. And then it goes outward into all of these other places. And I do believe that things are changing, because in Alaska, the white raven has returned. And the prophecy of that, the late grandmother Rita Pitka Blumenstein said, is when the white raven returns, the people will become wise again and will be seeking peace again. And so that gives me hope and strength in this, Dogaden.
Well, thank you. And we have come to the end of our time, and I need to turn it back over to our organizer. But let me just first convey my gratitude to each of you again. I mean, this has been fantastic. I think that our pretty large audience has gotten a lot out of what you've had to say today. So I really appreciate the care with which you prepared your remarks and the clarity with which you shared these sorts of things, the examples you gave. And this last discussion, I think, helped to round out and illuminate some of the work that we've been up to in really important ways. So thanks. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this conversation will be continued in a slightly different way. All of you are invited and hopefully will participate in this upcoming Indigenous Ways of Knowing Symposium that we're going to host in Montana in May. It's sponsored by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and Evidence for Action and Partners for Advancing Health Equity. And we're bringing 20 Indigenous scholars to come talk about Indigenous ways of knowing and their relevance for health. And you each will be there. I'm looking forward to seeing you there, of course, in person, but also other folks will be joining us. So thanks everyone for today. And let me now give the floor back to Dr. Hoover for some final closing remarks. I'm told that we'll just disappear when she's done. So this is bye from us. And please, Dr. Hoover.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gahn, and all of our panelists. This has been fabulous. Thank you for sharing your time and your expertise. To all of our attendees, we appreciate your thoughtful questions and for joining us. Again, I just want to let you know that this has been recorded. You'll receive a link to the recording, a transcript, and lecture materials in about 2 weeks. After we close here, you should receive a 1-minute survey to complete, and we value your feedback. We would love to hear your thoughts. We also want to hear from you on topics that you would like us to cover. You can email us at science@apa.org with recommendations. We hope you'll subscribe to Science Spotlight. Simply go to apa.org/science and you can get access to all of our materials. Many of you asked if you could follow up directly with the panelists. I will ask that if you email me at science@apa.org, I am happy to forward those messages on for you. And again, thanks so much and hope everyone has a wonderful day.